Welcome. My name is Andreas Novy. I'm working at Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I will give you a presentation on deglobalization within the summer school on alternative economic and monetary systems, which is definitively a very important issue, and especially when linking these questions of alternative economic systems to the challenge of social ecological transformation. And the topic that I'm dealing with is whether and in how far deglobalization plays a constructive or dangerous role in promoting these climate-friendly policies, the change towards decarbonization, the shift towards sustainable, resilient economic systems. And for some, deglobalization is a real challenge and a threat, as global problems like climate crisis have to be dealt with and solved with at global level. So deglobalization is somehow hindering the achievement of these policy goals. And there are others that argue that it is this neoliberal globalization, called hyperglobalization by others, this strong increase of economic connections worldwide, which is based on fossil fuel infrastructure, that is the main responsible for our current climate crisis. And deglobalizing transport, mobility, resource use would be an important aspect of a social ecological transformation. Based on this, I have presented a PowerPoint presentation, which I will show you now. And hopefully we have the chance afterwards in the discussion to go a little bit in detail. I will try to stick to the 30 minutes that were suggested to me, and leave some minutes for reflections on the implications of what I've been presenting on the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant changes in the socioeconomic system. As I said, there are those strong proponents of globalization. By the way, a term that does not have a long history. It started to be used often only in the 1990s. It's become within one decade a key term, becoming part of colloquial language, but it didn't exist before. But it's strongly linked to what's called liberal cosmopolitanism, this idea that free trade, global financial markets are a precondition for peace. Economic globalization goes hand in hand with the globalization of ideas, of political cooperation. So there are positive synergies between globalization in different domains. And if we look at effects, very stylized, very quickly, indeed, there is an ongoing so-called soft globalization over the last years in the spheres of culture, sports, international events, global World Cups, World Championships, getting increasing audience to the detriment of local cultural and sports activities. Science is becoming international, global. tourism, mass tourism has been one of the key growing industries over the last years until the COVID-19 pandemic. But on the other hand, there is military economic deglobalization. The value of exported goods as share of global GDP is stagnating or even shrinking. Foreign direct investment is very far away from the high levels of the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s. And global governance, the supranational rulemaking is also in a severe crisis. And just to end, because that's important for our further reflection, how this concept of globalization and the term is strongly linked to the political project of Western hegemony. It was started to be used with the end of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and starting a new era of US dominance, which over the last years has been increasingly challenged, especially by China and East Asia. On the other hand, deglobalization is therefore somehow in certain fields with respect to global governance, with respect to trade wars, currency wars, effect. As I said, the shrinking of world trade over the last years. So there are strong signals of a deglobalization after the great financial crisis of 2008. Some call it a deglobalization 2.0 because there was another turn towards deglobalization after the 1930s and the Second World War, ending the first globalization of the 19th century up to the First World War. So in the sense, it's a fact, but I will argue it is not only a fact, it is also a precondition that certain economic fields are deglobalized. This would be a precondition for increasing international cooperation. So I argue that especially the integrated global financial markets are a key problem to financial and economic stability, and the globalized transport infrastructure heavily dependent on fossil fuels is a key hindrance for a social ecological transformation. And I will argue in favor of what I call planetary coexistence as taking the best out of the shift towards globalization, but acknowledging the importance of deglobalization, regionalization in certain domains, so somehow striking a new balance between globalization and deglobalization. As I already said, current deglobalization dynamics are not new. There was already a shift towards inward orientation and deglobalization after the 1930s. In fact, starting with the First World War, what's called liberal globalization, first globalization, imperialist globalization based on the gold standard in the 19th century. That was well analyzed by Karl Polanyi and showing its limitations and the political consequences it led to: fascism, social democracy. And then the deglobalization dynamics of the 1930s leading to welfare capitalism, inward-oriented modes of development, again resulting with the end of the Bretton Woods system, with the end of fixed exchange rates in a new round of globalization, neoliberal globalization, hyperglobalization, which might be coming to an end again with the current great financial crisis and the current pandemic. Here I listed you some data that you can have a look at. I won't enter in detail at the moment, but it is definitively interesting to have a look at, because what you see in the data on the one hand is there is a strong tendency towards deglobalization from the 1970s onwards. While after the Second World War, growth of global GDP was strongly accompanying export shares, so they remained stable. The increase in exports and the increase in domestic production went more or less hand in hand. That changed after the 1970s with a huge increase in exports and export shares until 2008. Then from then on, a stagnation and going backwards. And more dramatic and really dramatic, that's the data on China, where you see a tremendous inward orientation, a strengthening of domestic markets announced by the Chinese government and implemented by the Chinese governments, and the dramatic decrease of the export share. Interestingly, to accompany this, and if you want to go a little more in detail, I put in the data for South Africa as well, where you can see that these waves of globalization, deglobalization resulted in patterns of inequality. So you have an increase in inequality during periods of globalization and the shrinking of inequalities within countries during the more inward-oriented development path, even in a country, that's why I put South Africa, that was characterized by apartheid, which is a cruel form of discrimination and inequality. But even under apartheid inward orientation, there was less inequality than under neoliberal democracy from the 1990s onwards. And here you have the data on the US. What I will present in the next 10, 15 minutes is the political trilemma of the world economy, the so-called globalization trilemma of Dani Rodrik, and a model that I elaborated based on this, which I call the political trilemma of social ecological transformation. Dani Rodrik argued against liberal cosmopolitanism and the liberal consensus that became dominant from the 1990s onwards. That was always present, but really became dominant in the 1990s, assuming that one can have hyperglobalization, strong nation states, and democracy. And he says that's not possible. You always have to pick 2 out of 3. You have to drop one of the policy objectives. And in fact, in history, we can observe the different combinations, more or less successful. Going back to the historical periods, he argues that with the gold standard and the dominance of the UK, there was an international economic integration secured by the military force of the British Empire and the gold standard. That's called the Golden Straitjacket in the 19th century, that went hand in hand with constitutional nation states with very limited policy space and hardly any economic policy space. That was possible because democracy, mass politics didn't exist in the 19th century. With mass democracy, there were the turbulent 20s and 30s with all the crises and catastrophes when hyperglobalization, the gold standard nation-state democracy, was achieved, aimed at. Together, the result was, in many cases, that democracy was dismantled from the 1930s onwards, also hyperglobalization, and only after the Second World War, a new equilibrium was established, welfare capitalism based on international cooperation. The UN system was built up, but no hyperglobalization in the sense of economic integration. It was at a very low level after the Second World War. World trade and financial markets remained strongly regulated. There were capital controls and fixed exchange rates. So the Bretton Woods Compromise sacrificed hyperglobalization and was built on national sovereignty and democracy. With the end of the Bretton Woods system, the end of the Soviet Union, many attempted at a new equilibrium based on hyperglobalization and democracy. And the term that should stabilize this was global governance, which was an advanced form of dealing internationally with the challenging global challenges of climate crisis, of hunger, poverty, and other human rights, other burning worldwide problems. And deliberately, the idea was to hollow out the nation state as being anachronistic, a hindrance to problem solving, because ecological problems do not end at national borders, so they have to be dealt with at the global level. That's a thesis strongly influenced by Karl Polanyi. We can talk about this later on in the joint discussion, where he argued exactly this illusionary attempt of the liberals sticking to a global standard while not sacrificing democracy and national sovereignty. That turned out to be impossible in the 1930s, and it is attempted again currently. That's why this joint analysis of the 1930s and the first globalization is of great importance for understanding current developments. So as we said, we had these three options somehow attempted during history. And what can we learn from this for now? How can we deal with climate change, right-wing populism, Trump, Brexit, etc.? So the issue of contesting is on the agenda again, and I will relate it to social ecological transformation, and I will postulate a political trilemma emerging out of this by studying in detail the trilemma of Roderick. I am convinced that one has to go a step further. The step further contains two steps. The first is that his core concepts have to be better defined and broadened and distinguished. There is a distinction between transferring sovereignty to supranational bodies, courts, and laws, like the dispute settlement courts in the trade and investment agreements. That's called deep integration, and that's what Roderick calls hyperglobalization. And that's a deeply neoliberal project, which is different from free trade of commodities, which many economists assume is a good thing with respect to efficiency and division of labor. But it becomes much more problematic when trade and investment agreements also structure health and labor market regulation, and that's deep integration, hyperglobalization, and that really poses a threat to democracy and nation state, and that's challenged by organizations like ATTAC and many environmental NGOs as well. With respect to democracy, one has to distinguish between liberal democracy, that's based on majority rule and minority right, human rights, civic rights, a free press, the rule of law, etc. And electoral democracy, which is an illiberal form of democracy, getting rid of the protection of minorities, is influencing the judiciary, etc., but sticking to elections. That's definitively the Russian case. Turkey is going in this direction, but unfortunately also Hungary and Poland. Social democracy, they're having a broader concept of democracy, of social rights included in political democracy. And I propose as a political project, socioeconomic democratization. And the nation state, one has to distinguish between the essentialist homogenizing aspects of nationalism that became dominant in the 20th century. It was not always like this. Between the nation as a power container, and between different types of territorial self-determination, the city as a sovereign body, the region, nation, the European Union. And my argument is that you have a trilemma, yes, consisting of these three poles, globalization, democracy, and the nation state. But the point is, and what we observe today, one has to decide what is the key policy objective. And there is only one core policy objective. That's important to understand what I call nationalistic capitalism. Trump's, Bolsonaro's, and others. It's also true for liberal globalism, which definitively gives primacy to free economic exchange, economic globalization, and less emphasis on national sovereignty and democracy, and a project of socioeconomic democratization, which I favor and which I consider most compatible with social ecological transformation, which has to be based on what I call planetary coexistence. Out of this result three ways of relating the three nodes to one another, putting limitless hyperglobalization, the idea of one big market, everything can be traded against everything at center stage with some type of global governance, more or less active. That was the world of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Angela Merkel. That's liberal globalism. While the others are definitively secondary. Nationalistic capitalism is a very strange model, hardly expected. You have radical neoliberals like the Republican Party in the US, the economic policymakers in Brazil, which are heavy neoliberals, but they are first and foremost centered on the nation state, on a supremacist authoritarian form of politics, exclusionary concept of insiders and outsiders, and opportunistic relationship to globalization and democracy. Many of them, Trump, Bolsonaro, Orban, are elected, and now recently Duda in Poland. So you cannot say they are anti-democratic, but they have illiberal understanding of democracy, and they are very often in favor of free trade if it is favorable to your own companies. And finally, there is socioeconomic democratization based on what I call planetary coexistence, which puts the idea of democracy in a broader sense of all residents taking part in decision-making, in shaping their polity, their socioeconomic system. And for sure that is different in different places of the world, so it has to be contextualized. And that means certain aspects of globalization, international cooperation on common goods is very recommendable, whereas selective economic deglobalization is necessary as well. And while one has to restrain nationalism, this does not include that nation states like cities and the European Union should have an autonomous policy space to implement social, ecological, socioeconomic policies. Coming to an end in this very quick presentation, and it's more an appetizer than a full presentation. Deglobalization and COVID-19, I think that the trend towards deglobalization will be persistent. It started with the great financial crisis 2008. We can observe it in statistics already before the pandemic, but it's very probable that this tendency will continue. And that means that out of the three options, liberal globalism, nationalistic capitalism, and socioeconomic democratization, liberal globalism is not a very realistic option. There are strong tendencies that will undermine this, even if one considers it the best option. I consider is not a very high probability that it can be implemented. Nationalistic capitalism is existing. We have it here. I described it this way, and it is definitively a key danger for many aspects of our civilization, and also because many of them are climate change deniers or skeptics. So socioeconomic democratization based on planetary coexistence is, I assume, a realistic and the most attractive option. As trade and currency wars will continue, they might get accommodated a little bit with Trump losing the election, but that's not sure. And the dismantling of the international institution is quite advanced. We have heard a lot about the World Health Organization, but the same is true with the World Trade Organization, a key pillar of neoliberal globalization. It's very probable that global supply chain, mass tourism will not return to normal in the next years, which means that inward orientation will somehow be imposed on countries, and we see it with the Austrian Prime Minister that he has no problem with border taxes if they protect Austrian and European industries. So I assume that deglobalization remains on the agenda, and in the remaining 3 slides, which I will present very quickly, there are some presented some of the elements which such a progressive form of deglobalization, together with planetary coexistence, with empowering the population, could consist, and what would be required. It definitively would require dismantling some of the cornerstones of hyperglobalization. That's ordoliberalism, that is idea dominant in the European Union and is very strong in Germany. The idea that the market is the best institution for dealing with all types of socioeconomic problems. If you use other economic institutions like a public social security system or one provider of certain services, then this has to be justified because there is a clear supremacy of the market, overcoming ordoliberalism, implementing a form of mixed economy, very important, overcoming financialization, and transforming the fossil fuel-based infrastructures that make connecting spaces so cheap and easy, and strengthening more territorialized social ecological infrastructures that increase the quality of life of residents in a way that does not require individual consumption. It's collective provisioning, what place-based social ecological infrastructure like green spaces, public spaces, leisure activities, a decentralized mobility and care infrastructure. But that's not easy to achieve. That's why I assume and I propose that political struggles should center more on the form of the infrastructural regime and the strengthening of social ecological infrastructure, the dismantling of an unviable infrastructure that sustains hyperglobalization, and the building up of a place-based infrastructure that is more compatible with deglobalized economic activities, with decommodification. That's why I think that universal basic services that offer good services and infrastructure for all is a better way of universal protection than a basic income. But that can be discussed in our joint discussion. I will stop at that point. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussions.